Hello everybody, welcome into the SFS channel. My name is Gavin, and in today's episode, I'm going to be breaking down my top 30 running back tiers and rankings for Week 14 fantasy football. This week is quite interesting. We have 6 NFL teams participating in their bye weeks, so we have just 26 teams to pick our players from. Thus, you're going to see a top 30 running back position group where there are multiple players that aren't necessarily their team's quote-unquote official starter in the tiers and rankings. Not that that typically matters too much anyways, because some backfields can produce multiple players, but that's obviously very few and far between. So keep your eye on the depth and distribution of the players in today's episode. As I said, it's very unique circumstances for a very big week of games here for Week 14. So as always, thanks so much for stopping by and tuning in, you guys. Let's get right on into today's episode. All right, here we go. As I always do with this first tier here, we're diving right on in. We've got 8 total tiers for today. That typically fluctuates a little bit depending on the week here. 8 tiers for today. So what I do with these top players, we typically know who the best players are going to be in any given week, or at least who projects to be the easy choices for these selections. So I'm going to cover them very quickly here, basically just graze through the matchups, then we're going to move on to the next couple of tiers, which are somewhat similar for today's episode. But Austin Eckler against Miami, my running back one here entering into this week. Derrick Henry taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars, who he has owned, throughout his NFL career. He's had some monster games against this team, although, of course, the personnel today are a lot better and different than they've been in years past. Christian McCaffrey, quite possibly, in my opinion, maybe the only person that benefits from the insertion of Brock Purdy into the 49ers offense. Obviously, Eli Mitchell is now on IR. We did see a little bit of Jordan Mason in this past week's games, but I think that the target involvement that CMC had in the passing game was really impressive last week. And then Josh Jacobs here taking on the LA Rams. This is a matchup that was really difficult on paper a couple of weeks ago, but with the injuries sustained to this Rams team, the fact that their quarterback position continually gets more and more thinned out here, and then I just think this Raiders team is going to have their way with this group. I expect Josh to be once again an elite running back for this week's games. Let's jump on into tier 2. Just a couple of names in this tier here. Nick Chubb starting things off at Cincinnati. This is a big game for this Browns team. I think that there is a chance that things go south here. Obviously, we saw the rust with Deshaun Watson and this Browns offense a week ago. Hopefully they can start to get a little bit back on track here, because this Cincinnati defense, I would say, is fairly underrated, especially against the run. And if they start to get into a negative game script here where they're trailing late in this contest or for much of the second half, that could impact Chubb's ability to have fantasy effectiveness. And then Saquon here, a guy who a couple of weeks ago, if he had this Philadelphia Eagles matchup, I would be just drooling all over it here. But this team, now that they've got Jordan Davis back here, they're getting a little bit healthier. I know Chauncey Gardner-Johnson just went to the IR, but in terms of the immediate front seven for the run game, this does look to be a bit tougher. I talked about this a couple of weeks back, or have been talking about it here. I see some minimal erosion, or not minimal, some noticeable erosion with this Giants offensive team here, and that is a little bit troubling and concerning to me. We did see some life against the Commanders this past week, and Saquon was pretty decent in that game, so hopefully that carries over into this matchup, but I do have, again, a little bit more faith in that Eagles stopping the run than I did, say in week 10 or 11. Here we go with by far our beefiest tier of the day to this point. 5 names in this grouping, our running back 7 through 11 here. Starting it out with Ramondre Stevenson on the road taking on the Arizona Cardinals here. For me, Ramondre always has a solid floor. You look at him as really the centerpiece of this New England Patriots offense. They're looking to get him the football in both the passing and rushing phases of the game here. So you're going to get that opportunity share and that work every single week. Again, the ceiling can be there, especially in matchups like this one where New England, I think, actually has a shot to keep this competitive, if not control the pace of this game against a struggling Cardinals team. We'll see how this one plays out, though. Tony Pollard definitely has probably the highest ceiling of anyone in this tier. This week, he's got a Houston Texans rushing defense, which has been amongst the league worst throughout the entirety of this NFL season. So if Tony can find himself getting out in space, explosive runs, scoring touchdowns catching big passes, you're going to see him go nuts in this game, and he is absolutely capable of doing that in nearly any matchup. So for Tony Pollard, it's all about that ceiling. We know Zeke's going to get his touches. I have him as a very viable play this week. You're going to hear from him or about him in just a couple of minutes' time here, but Tony Pollard, a very strong start this week. Dalvin Cook next up, my number 9 running back at Detroit this week. Detroit's defensive stoutness against the run has actually risen over the second half of this NFL season. They've been, they went from last season absolutely being the laughing stock of the league in the defense that you could just pick apart, especially in the run game. Now, they still have their struggles against the pass here, but they've gotten better in terms of their front seven, filling gaps and making running backs spill it to the sideline and then, tackling them out in space. So for Dalvin Cook here, I hate to say this, I say this basically every week, but I don't have a ton of confidence in his actual yardage production. I want to see him get in the end zone in order for him to have maximum successfulness here, and I think that's ultimately what this matchup is going to come down to again, of whether or not he finishes as a top 12 running back. Travis Etienne next up here, maybe possibly a little bit banged up still after that foot injury he sustained. He had another down performance last week. Now, part of that was getting absolutely housed by the Detroit Lions. The passing game script was basically in effect from early in that contest. Now, we would have liked to see Travis a little bit more involved in that comeback effort, especially with his skills he has as a receiving threat. So it was unfortunate not to see that. This week he is at Tennessee. That can be a stout matchup here. You're going to want to see Travis rip one of those longer runs, get some of that effectiveness going out in space in order for him to have that value. Now, I think his floor, we've seen it since the injury, has been a little bit diminished here. That leaves me a little bit less confident in him, but of course, that ceiling is always there, especially if Jacksonville can keep this a tight game. Joe Mixon. Now, this is a little bit risky for me personally to put him up this high in the list as my running back 11. This is me operating under the assumption and hopefulness, the optimism that he will play this week. This week they have the Cleveland Browns. I think Cincinnati has a really good shot to dictate the tempo of this game. Like I said earlier, I'm not so confident that Deshaun Watson has, brushed off the rust and is 100% ready to go and actually play big-time competitive playoff football atmosphere-like games against an in-division soon-to-be rival. I don't know if they're quite established to that yet since they haven't played a game against each other with the Deshaun Watson-led Browns. But at this point in time, I'm confident in Mixon when he is out there as the team's lead back. The trend with concussions has been once you're available to go on the field, you're 100% ready to go. Obviously, they don't let you play if you still have a concussion, so if he's out there, he gets the green light for me. He's a fringe RB1 in his first game back, and this is a Cleveland defense that is relatively exploitable as long as Cincinnati doesn't let Myles Garrett get after the passer too much and force them to continue passing, obviously if they were to get into a rabbit hole like they did back on Halloween. All right, here we go with our tier 4 players. So this is actually probably the highest I've ever had Isaiah Pacheco in a tiers video, and this is definitely the highest we've had Najee Harris since probably weeks 2 or 3 of this season, if not straight up just dropping him down after week 1. I have to go back and look, but for Ezekiel Elliott here, this is a player, I talked about it earlier. It's a great matchup. He's getting inside the 5-yard line opportunities. He's getting those touchdowns. He's being that sledgehammer. Now, Tony will get a carry here and there in that area of the field, but with this matchup, the expected game script I expect an absolute domination from the Dallas Cowboys over this Houston Texans team. We should see a lot of mop-up duty and a heavy volume of rushing spread out between these two stud players. Miles Sanders here at the New York Giants. This is a matchup where this could go one of two ways. Miles Sanders had a pretty quiet week this past week. However, he did score a touchdown, which saved his weekly fantasy lineup value. I expect that to be a similar trend here for this week's games. The Giants have done a solid job and do have a solid front seven and can at least hold opposing running backs in check without an extremely explosive run or getting another one of those opportunities that he breaks in for a touchdown. I think Miles could be a little bit of a risky running back 2-level start here, but as my RB13 for this week, and obviously with the teams we have on bye here, he is clearly a high-level running back 2 start, so not necessarily even considering benching him here. Isaiah Pacheco at Denver. This is a matchup that's all about the game script for me. This is a really tough Denver defense. However, Patrick Mahomes, if I'm going to bet on anyone to slice through that thing and pick up touchdowns, it's Mahomes. I expect a very solid game script, as I said, in the second half, and running the football should be a big focal point for this team. Of course, that they have a lead against a team, which I hope they do, and the Denver Broncos that hasn't scored more than 3 touchdowns since that Halloween date we referenced earlier. And then Najee Harris this week taking on Baltimore. This is more so, and while I do want to give Najee some credit here for the trending upwards of the offense, him looking a little bit better here, this is more of the absence of other players than it is necessarily me having confidence in him as a true weekly top 15 RB play. I do think that there is an opportunity against a Baltimore team with Tyler Huntley and likely not Lamar Jackson, that this team does have more success here, and that this Steelers offense, maybe the Steelers win the game outright. That's very much so on the board here. And of course, if that's the case and they're dictating their tempo and obviously the game script here, you're going to have more rushing attempts. But for Najee, it's a touchdown dependent RB2 level situation. Even when he goes out there and gets to 85, 90 scrimmage yards, it still isn't all that flattering. So I'm hoping for the best for Najee here. I've seen encouraging signs in multiple weeks in a row here from this Pittsburgh Steelers offense. Hopefully they can stack another game here and prove me right-ish, but also wrong, because I am still pessimistic here. It's an interesting dynamic between my relationship with the Pittsburgh Steelers and their weekly outlook. But at the end of the day, he is our RB15 for this week. So let's hop into tier 5. All right, so this tier is really interesting to me. So we've got the 2 Lions running backs ranked back-to-back here because there's really interesting trains of thought that can be applied to both players. For DeAndre Swift, he had his first 50+% snap count percentage of any time this season since week 8. And for Jamal Williams, it was his first time dipping below 40% since week 9. So the week after Swift kind of had his drop off here. Makes sense. The thought here is that if DeAndre Swift is taking this backfield back over, he should be the guy that leads this team in opportunities. But the goal line use and the inside the 5 involvement for Jamal Williams makes a case where you could still have a valid argument that Jamal Williams will continue to be the more productive fantasy football player. So literally, if DeAndre goes out there, doesn't score a touchdown, and has a down week in any given performance from here on out, and Jamal goes out there and gets you 30 yards and a touchdown, that's 9 or so points, depending on your scoring format, of course. If there was a catch involved and you're a PPR league and whatnot, you get what I'm trying to say here. So for DeAndre, I would argue the ceiling is far higher. The floor is probably lower. Jamal continued to score touchdowns last week. He had an early touchdown. I believe it was a first quarter run that ended up getting him into the double-digit threshold. But then you had DeAndre Swift catching passes over 100 yards from scrimmage and looking really good. So against Minnesota this week, there is definitely opportunity for the taking. I'm interested to see if DeAndre is just kind of, tugging our chain here and giving us a little bit of a run for our money, or if this is actually going to be something that continually going forward is actually going to be a sustainable fantasy situation and scenario. James Conner right behind them. I have loved what I've seen from Conner since his return to full health here. He has been the lead workhorse running back for this offense. I just have my skepticisms in this matchup. It's purely a matchup thing here for me. If he scores a touchdown, it's going to be great, but I could see a scenario where his touchdown being produced makes it look like he had a floor game. I don't see too much of a ceiling here. This isn't a guy that gets explosive runs. He is a, steady Eddie, just kind of plugging away and continuing to swing the axe there, and then hoping he gets in the end zone and scores multiple touchdowns. If that's the case, he could pop for, 80 scrimmage yards and 2 touchdowns, 20 fantasy points. That's great. But again, at the end of the day, this isn't the matchup where I'd predict that to happen. So just a little bit lower on him than I would typically be here for a guy who's had a pretty decent schedule since returning. So this tier is really interesting here. So I'm kicking it off with Jeff Wilson Jr. coming off of a 1 carry for 3-yard performance. Now, I'm going to talk about that in just a second here, but Jeff's got the Chargers, a very favorable opposing matchup for this week for both, rushing threats and pass catching threats. And I do expect a strong bounce back from this Miami offense. Now, I think that last week things got a little bit shuffled up here. It was only 8 total rushing attempts between Raheem Mostert and Jeff Wilson Jr. for 33 total yards against what I, assume to be here. I shouldn't say assume, but what I think, the eye test and analytics tell me the combination of the two, the San Francisco 49ers defense is all around from top to bottom, probably the most stout and tough opposing group in the league. So I think that Mike McDaniel might have gotten a little bit inside of his head here. I think that there's a little bit of just mistaken play calling here and screwing up from a preparation standpoint. So I am hoping, and resting my faith in the fact that they will get back to running the ball at a semi-effective rate here this week. I do think there is a scenario where, because Raheem Mostert outsnapped Jeff Wilson Jr. here, maybe this is a true hot-handed dynamic, and they're just going to go back and forth to these two players, and you're never going to really know who the true starter is. But for me, it's been Jeff Wilson Jr. every single week since he got there at the trade deadline. Up until this past game. So I'm going to continue forward here, assuming that continues to be the precedent, and putting my faith in Jeff Wilson. Dameon Pierce against Dallas. This one I have a little less faith in than I have in even previous matchups for this Texans team. This week, the Cowboys are a team we just saw. They absolutely killed the Colts in the fourth quarter. Now, they let them, hang around for 3 quarters, but then when it became money time and they had to put the game away, they absolutely mopped the floor with Indianapolis. This Texans team is far worse than the Colts are, and I think that this Texans team is pretty susceptible to getting absolutely destroyed within the first quarter and a half to 2 quarters in this game. So, A, game script I predict to be just terrible for Dameon Pierce here. B, I've seen Dare Ogunbowale get far too many snaps inside the 5-yard line for my liking as a Dameon Pierce owner. These things are very frustrating, and this limits what he can be as a fantasy football player and limits his overall utility to your fantasy lineup. So I view him as a low-end RB2 going forward. He's honestly in the RB3 discussion for me when we've got those other 6 teams back here and actually have some legitimate players. This could end up being a game where, you saw him for back-to-back weeks. He totaled 2.5 fantasy points. This could be another one of those absolutely miserable games, but since he's had flashes of such good play here throughout this season, it's the only reason he's still at this point in the rankings list. Deontay Foreman here at Seattle. The ground matchup is favorable in this one. Deontay, Chubb, it should be obviously that mix of a 1-2 punch here. We'll see how things play out in this matchup. The reason we like Foreman over Chuba Hubbard is obviously I feel more comfortable with him inside the 5-yard line for that usage, and obviously his capability of scoring a rushing touchdown. This tier is also very interesting to me. So tier 7 for today's episode, Rachaad White and Leonard Fournette, obviously teammates back-to-back on the tiers list here. They scored roughly the same amount of fantasy points this week. Their involvement in usage was really interesting to watch, though, on Monday Night Football against the New Orleans Saints. So, essentially, for most of the game, it seemed like Rachaad White was kind of the back to own. That's why I give him some slight precedence here. He was the guy that throughout the majority of this game, I felt was having an impact on this offense and was frequently touching the ball. Now, their blocking is terrible. They create little to no holes in the run game to get past, and when he was catching the ball in space, Tampa's linebackers are so fast, they were on him like that, and he was obviously getting tackled, having very minimal success here. But what I will say is the snap count percentages swung back in favor of Leonard Fournette, because down the stretch of the contest, the final 2 drives for Tom Brady and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, when they actually went out there and scored, it was Leonard Fournette in the game for those critical downs and crucial situations. Now, with the exception of the biggest play of the game, where Rachaad White scored the game-winning touchdown. So it was a really weird dynamic. It's still very muddy and hard to sift through. These are both capable players. It's evident to me, though, that Rachaad White is more twitchy. He's more explosive. He's clearly in better shape if you look at Leonard Fournette out there. I actually had planned, I forgot to have my joke of the day here. I was going to say Leonard Fournette is Eddie Lacy Jr. here, because he looks like he is absolutely packing when he is running around there in shoulder pads. Dude looks like he's got his flak jacket on and whatnot, and of course, he could be wearing a winter coat underneath his jersey. But for Fournette here, obviously still a battering ram, can still score touchdowns, can catch the football, but it's clear and evident, as I said, Rachaad White's a better route runner. He's more explosive, more twitchy, and both of these guys, I think, are just going to kind of eat up each other's fantasy value to an extent here and be lower-end RB2s going forward. Cam Akers, last on the tier here, taking on the Las Vegas Raiders. He had a 72% snap count percentage this week. I don't expect efficiency from him, but what I do expect is opportunities. He had 18 of them this week. Could be roughly around 20 again here in a matchup against the Raiders, where they've got banged up quarterbacks. Yet again, Stafford's on IR. He has a spinal cord contusion. That's very bad. John Wolford got banged up in that game. It's Bryce Perkins. It's Baker Mayfield. Probably won't see him this week, but it's a disaster. And so they have to lead on this run game in some way, shape, or form here. And obviously, those touchdowns can result as a result. So here we go. With that tier, that concludes that concludes tier 7 here. Let's jump into the 8th and final tier. Here we go, the final tier. So kicking it off with Zonovan Knight against the Buffalo Bills. Last week, Zonovan had 15 touches for 90 yards. He did rip a 41-yarder, though, that kind of buffed those stats up a bit. I do expect minimal receiving involvement. We'll see if Michael Carter can play here. His value is essentially clinging onto the fact that Michael Carter is out of the lineup because he will then promote himself to be the lead back for this team. But under the information we have right now, that is where we are headed with this. Latavius Murray here taking on Kansas City. I talked about this matchup earlier with Pacheco. I do expect Kansas City to get out to a very comfortable lead against this team. Now, I'm not saying they're going to go for 30 on this Broncos defense. I still have a great deal of respect for them. But, man, if Kansas City gets to 20, I just don't see how Denver even gets into sniffing distance of that. So I think running the football is going to be very tough to do. And obviously their passing game doesn't necessarily have the most success this season. Raheem Mostert really just got boosted up here because of his 7 carries and 60-plus snap count percentage this past week. It's pathetic that I said that he's up here because of his 7 carries, but realistically, that's the reason he's up here is because he out-touched the other running back in the backfield, who yet you can call me crazy, still have ranked above him. So we'll see how this backfield dynamic continues to play out here for this week, but I'm going to try and forget about last week, think of it as an anomaly, and if things continue to trend in other directions, we'll reevaluate for week 15 in round 1 of the playoffs. Devin Singletary here, just missing the cut for this week. By the way, my running back 31 is James Cook, his teammate. So I'm staying away from Singletary in this week's matchup. He's got the Jets. They've been very stingy. It was a 44% snap count percentage for Singletary, 43% to James Cook. James Cook was far more productive. However, until we see a true backfield takeover, I would look at Singletary as the continued starter, quote-unquote, even though it's a committee, and you don't want him in your fantasy lineup. Chuba Hubbard here, we talked about him briefly with Deontay Foreman. I expect Foreman to get those goal line rushing touchdown opportunities. Chuba, though, is more explosive. He is technically, or was technically, the team's starter, so he's going to get touches in this offense. They're going to have 65-35, 60-40, maybe even a 55-45, depending on the week split here. So for Chuba, he does have some very low-end flex value for this week. And then DJ Dallas, look at him looking at you down there. He has got himself quite the facial posture there for that picture. But for DJ Dallas, he's got Carolina this week. Seattle can absolutely run the table in this game. I think Geno Smith and that offense should be able to get in scoring territory. They should be able to control the pace of this game. Maybe that isn't the case here. DJ Dallas does have an ankle injury coming into this game, so you could actually see Tony Jones Jr. be the starter. It's too early in the week to really say officially and definitively what the health status and scenario will be for this game, but of course that is what we have access to for right now. So here we go. As of Wednesday morning, these are my top 30 running back tiers and rankings for week 14. As always, if you guys enjoyed, smash that like button. It means a lot to me. It helped me a lot out. Helped me out a lot here on the channel, and I appreciate the heck out of all you for tuning into today's episode. We've got our wide receiver episode coming out today as well, so make sure to stay tuned for that, and I will see you in that episode. Peace out.